come back into this. We're a couple more points on what we were just talking about. Talking about defending others. And whether or not that should be a valid exception to this rule about not violence, not doing violence. Right? So if you think about it for a minute, right? There's a lot of people, a lot of men, if you see a woman being attacked, right? You would say, I have to go defend her, right? And there would be a lot of men that in that moment would go and they would grab that guy and beat him up or whatever, right? Because you see it. It's right there. Well, what if it's around the corner? What if it's even closer to you, but you just can't see it, it's in the other room? Does that mean you suddenly don't have a responsibility anymore? To do what's right? Because if going to beat up that guy is what's right, and defending all these poor and innocent people through force is the right thing to do, then shouldn't that mean that Christian men are roaming around looking for injustice to battle? Right? To defeat? But it doesn't work like that. Right? Once I don't see it anymore, I don't think about it. Right? That's not my problem. Right? And evil is all around us. Right? This idea doesn't work out because violence is not the best solution. I can't solve all the world's problems by going around and beating up all the bad guys. Right? Like we said, some of the bad guys, they're going to be fine. They're going to beat me up instead. But there's a better solution. Right? So the whole Christian life, Christian examples, teachings that we have, is truly a much better method of controlling violence. Just like we saw from the story of John, right? Where he went and he spoke to that guy. Because he had a relationship, because he had an authority, because his life was really this powerful message, right? If John had gone in force to take that guy, it wouldn't have worked. Look back at these first centuries, Christians suffered horrible, horrible things for hundreds of years. You have to ask, would anybody really argue that their suffering would have been less if from the very beginning Christian men had gone and tried to defend their brothers with violence? Well, if you're going to hurt me, that's fine. But if you're going to hurt my brother, then I'm going to hurt you. Well, everybody's getting hurt. That means I've got to go fight all the time, right? That means there is no gentleness, right? There is no peace. Because Christians everywhere are being hurt. If those Christians had turned to bloodshed at the very beginning, they would have just been wiped out. Right? Because that's what happens. Right? Because they would have been criminals just like everybody else. Just like the Romans thought that they were. Just like Nero claimed that they were, all the horrible things that they did. But Christians didn't really do those things. There's a good story here about a lady named Sabina. She was sentenced to the brothel. Not to death, but sentenced to life as a prostitute. That's a pretty horrible sentence for a Christian lady, right? But no Christian knight came to save her, right? No men came in to defend her honor. But you know what she said? She answered to the judge that told her that. She said, the Holy God will see about that. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know, those three guys from the book of Daniel, and who wouldn't worship the image of the king. And he was going to throw them into a fiery furnace, and he said, well, you know, our God can save us. But even if he doesn't, we're still going to follow him. Right? That's the attitude that we have to have. Right? These, like you said, these guys aren't cowards, right? Cowards never would have endured torture like that. Right? They would have just said, forget it. Jesus is a fake. They would have offered their sacrifices to the emperor, and they would have lived a happy life. The only explanation for the lives of these people is that they really followed Jesus' teaching. Right? They were devoted to it. And they didn't do anything else. They just lived what Jesus taught them, and they changed the world. Right? None of us would be here today if it weren't for this. Now, going on from the treatment of wrongdoers, we want to consider for a minute Christians' experience of evil by soldiers. Right? Because obviously, if the soldiers are treating us badly, I don't maybe want to be a soldier, right? I don't want to go be in the army because the army is the one that's hurting us. Now we're going to look tomorrow at the other side of this, the Christian experience of good from soldiers, because there are both sides. Okay? We're going to look briefly at this. You consider for a minute John the Baptist, Jesus, James, Peter, Paul, probably other apostles as well. They were all abused and killed by soldiers. Either Roman soldiers or soldiers in the army of Herod. Right? Beginning with the Emperor Nero in 64 AD, Christians began to be officially persecuted. Right? And persecution would break out from time to time, more or less for over 250 years. It varied from place to place, right? In the severity and all of that, but more or less Christians were persecuted just for being who they were for 250 years. They were mostly persecuted by those soldiers, because the soldiers were the police. Right? Today we have an army, and we have police, and they're a little bit different. Right? You know, you don't really think of Siton as the army. Right? They have a different purpose. But for the Romans, that was all one thing. Right? They all did all the jobs. And so it was the soldiers that were responsible for torturing the people on trial, they tortured witnesses, right? Executing the prisoners, any Christian brought up on charges. Christians were burned at the stake. They were put to the rack, tied down and cut and burned and dismembered. They were covered in boiling oil, beaten, flogged, crucified, beheaded. This is what it was like to be a Christian those times. But they were serious about the things that they did. You look at the church, there was a church that was destroyed by the Praetorian Guard. That's the elite guard of the Roman army. And they came into it with full battle array and axes and everything. And they just demolished the church and killed the people inside. There's a town in Phrygia where the soldiers came in, and that whole town happened to be all Christian. Right? I don't quite know how it happened to be, but the whole village was a Christian village, and the soldiers just came in and burned the whole town. And burned all the inhabitants. Right? That doesn't speak well to the relationship of Christians and the army. Right? There's lots of other instances like that. Terrible things happen. I don't really have time to go into all the particulars, but feel free to go look it up. On the front of the outline, there's a link there to the text of the book that I was pulling all this stuff from, and he's got quite a few more references there. But even his isn't everything. But it's pretty easy to see that soldiers weren't always so nice to Christians. And if soldiers aren't nice to you, then maybe you don't want to be in the army. Right? And many Christians that were in the army, because there were Christians in the army, were killed by other members of the army because they didn't like Christians being in their army. They didn't trust them. Now we come to the last section in the disapproval of war, the actual refusal to participate in war. Right? All these things that we've talked about before, they lead up to this idea that Christians probably refused to participate. Right? But we need to look and see if they really. We're going to take some time tomorrow and look at how they actually participated in war, but this is where we're at tonight. So, the little information that we have of Christian participation in war seems to show this conclusion, that they didn't generally participate. It's interesting, if you look into history, you look in the book of Acts, there's the story of Cornelius, right, the centurion, that Peter converted in Acts chapter 10. Aside from him, and a couple of soldiers that may have been with him, and the jailer baptized by Paul in Philippi later on, there's no direct evidence of anyone in the army, of any soldier, becoming a Christian until 170 AD. That's a long time, for over 100 years. There are a few stories and inscriptions that might come out of that time, but some of them have been shown to be from later times or forgeries and things like that. But there's no evidence that any Christians were serving in the army from that time until there. Now, were they? Probably, actually. You know, I can't say that they were. And I can't say that soldiers in the army didn't become Christians, because we know that they did. But we don't have any evidence from that time. The only direct evidence we have comes from the reign of Marcus Aurelius, which is around 160 AD. Now, thinking of the Christian refusal to participate, Titanus, he condemned war as murderous. And Harnack, by the way, is a German scholar. He did a lot of research into this, into the Christian militia in the first 3 centuries. And he says that this guy was undoubtedly opposed to the military calling. Okay? Because this guy wrote, "I don't want to be a king, I don't want to be rich, I decline military command, and I hate fornication." Okay? So he refused to be a military commander. Some other evidence actually comes not from Christians, but from the heathens. Right? The heathen philosopher Celsus, he wrote a long series of things against Christianity. Right? And he talked about the problems with Christianity and the things that they did, and he urged them to come back. He said, you ought to take part in civil government. Right? Give the emperor your strength. Fight for him. Serve him as soldiers if he requires it, and share military command with him. It was apparently in his day, that's around 160, 170, that it was quite common for Christians to refuse to serve in the army, and refuse even to serve in the government. Okay? And he says you ought to do that. Okay? So that's pretty good evidence, because he says that if everyone behaved as the Christian did, then the emperor would be left all alone, and the barbarians would come in. So that shows that, as a rule, Christians did not serve in the army or in the civil government during his time, 100 years after the end of the New Testament. Like we said, the first reliable evidence of Christians in the army comes from the time of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, from 161 to 180 AD. So if you consider that, Harnack, again, talking about history, says it's not surprising that until the time of Marcus Aurelius, it wasn't really a question. There wasn't really a question about military service in the churches. Nobody thought about it. Should I be a soldier or not? Because the baptized Christian did not become a soldier. And those who were caught by the Christian faith in the camp had to see how they would come to terms with their military profession. Because if you're a soldier, if you're in the army, and you become a Christian, well, now you've got some decisions to make. Right? Just like anything else, whatever job you have, if you become a Christian, you might have to start doing it differently. We find the turning point during this time. This time of Marcus Aurelius was also the time of Tertullian. He makes it clear that there are a considerable number of Christians in the army. Okay, from his writings, so you can tell that there are Christians that have been in the army for some time. But, more importantly, there's a very strong unwillingness from most Christians to not be part of the army. Right? So, it's not a situation where Tertullian is a lone rebel pacifist, but most of the people are with him. Now, we remember back to his statement before. He said that Christians would go to war if it weren't for the teaching that said it was more lawful to be killed than to kill. So we know that he didn't want to go to war. He talks about the possibility of being a magistrate, right? Being one of the judges, the rulers. And he says something very interesting. He says basically, let's grant for a minute that it's possible to be a magistrate. Right? That it's possible to serve as a judge for a Christian. But what do you have to do? He says, well, you have to do it just under the mere name of the office, right? Because you can't sacrifice, right? You can't be part of the sacrificing. You can't lend your authority through the sacrificing. You can't contract for sacrificial victims. You can't assign people to care for the temples of the pagans, right? You can't see after their money. You can't give shows at your own expense, you know, gladiatorial shows and things are at the public expense. You can't use money for that kind of evil. You can't preside over those shows when they're being given. You can't make a proclamation or an edict. You can't even swear an oath. Right? Because Jesus said, don't swear. So he says, how can you be a magistrate if you can do all those things? If you can avoid all those things, sure you can be a magistrate. Oh wait, you still have a few more. You shouldn't judge anyone on a capital or criminal charge. You might judge some people about money, but you can't condemn anyone. You can't bind anyone. You can't imprison anyone. Right? It just doesn't work. You can't torture anyone. How can you be a magistrate if you can't do any of those things? Right? All you can do is maybe make decisions about whether somebody owes somebody money. Everything else is un-Christian. That's very interesting. He later talks about Christians in war, and he says, how will a Christian make war? How will he serve as a soldier even in peacetime without a sword? Which the Lord has taken away. Right? He really took literally that statement of Jesus to Peter, put back your sword, for those who take the sword die by it. Right? That means no swords. Don't take a sword. So if you don't have a sword, how can you be a soldier? Well, today, I can have a gun, I don't need a sword. I think you're missing the point. He says, for all those soldiers had come to John and received the form of a rule, right? John told them, don't be rude to anyone, don't extort money from anyone, be content with your pay. But that was before Jesus came. He says there was a centurion that believed, but the Lord afterwards, in disarming Peter, ungirded every soldier. Right? That means you don't have your weapon anymore. How can you serve as a soldier without a weapon? Doesn't make any sense. And he says, and he who is not the avenger of his own wrongs, shall he administer chains and imprisonments and tortures or executions? Right? Remember all those horrible things that we said that soldiers did? If you're a Christian, how can you do those things? Because that's your job. You're going to get ordered to do that if you're serving in the Roman army. Right? You might even have to kill your fellow Christian. Or cut off their arm. Or boil your children in a pot. Right? That doesn't match up very well, does it? Now he says, so basically, Christians shouldn't become soldiers, right? Because there's no way you can avoid all of the different things that you have to do, right? Everything about being a soldier is bad. Even the fact that you're taking your name from the kingdom of light and transferring it to the camp of darkness, right? That's not a good idea. But he says the case is different if faith comes to someone who's already a soldier, right? If you're already a soldier and you become a Christian, well, it's a little bit different. Because you already said that you were going to be a soldier, right? You already made your commitments and everything. But he says, all the same, when faith has been accepted and signed, you either have to quit the service, which has been done by many, he says, or you've got to start making all these little objections to every little thing, so that you don't do anything against God. All those reasons why you, Christian, wouldn't join the service, you have to avoid all those things. You can't sacrifice to Caesar. You can't go fighting anybody. And you can't be torturing people. You can't extort money from people. You know what? You have to make all sorts of little tiny decisions about all these little things in every part of your life, because almost every aspect of your job is against Christian principles of conduct. All right? So being a soldier is really hard if you're a Christian, because chances are you're going to go against that. And he says, you know, just because that's your job, that doesn't make it okay. Right? You can't say, well, it's my job, so I can do it. Because he says, no necessity of sinning have they whose one necessity is that of not sinning. You can't say, well, I have to do it. No, because the one thing you have to do is not sin. That's the one thing Christians are called to do. Do God's will. Don't sin. You can't say that something is so important that it requires you to sin, because you only have one job. Now, granted, idolatry was a big problem for serving in the Roman army. One that we don't really have today, right? But a big part of the problem was still the bloodshed and violence. Right? It wasn't all just about idolatry, about serving the emperor. It was both. Now, if you look at these different writers, and you read through what they have to say, you see that they have this idea of an alternative service that Christians do, right? And we saw that before, right? Where the guy said, well, you know, we're the best friends the emperor has, because we're all about peace, right? And we're praying for peace, and we're living peacefully, and we're not hurting anybody, right? Christians provide some great good for society, right? They have another service to do. Another thing to consider that isn't mentioned very often is that there were church orders, right? Official orders of the church in several places throughout the Roman Empire from the 3rd century and even later, right? Going on for almost 1,000 years, that soldiers and magistrates were not allowed to be immersed. They were not allowed to take communion. They were not allowed to be in the church unless they put aside their purple cape, unless they put aside their sword. They didn't kill anybody. There's one reference that says I don't remember if it's a magistrate or a soldier that's killed someone, should abstain from communion for 3 years. So it's very clear that these church orders show that it's not just, because one of the arguments is that these writers that we've been talking about are just the minority, right? That they're just one or two guys that had a lot of things to say, and that they don't represent the whole church. But when the official doctrine of the church on the books is if you're a soldier, you can't be a Christian, that's more than just one or two guys, right? And these things were in effect for hundreds of years, even after the time of Constantine. It's very interesting. Now we come to Origenes again, because he has some very interesting things to say against that guy Celsus that we were talking about. Because Celsus said, you need to serve in the army. You have to fight. Well, he says, well, look at yourself. You don't require everyone to join the army, right? You're priests. You don't allow them to fight. You don't allow them to shed blood, right? They have to keep their hands clean so that they can offer the sacrifices. Because if they become defiled by blood, then your gods won't accept them. How strange that even the pagans had that idea, right? He says, Origenes, the military service of the Christians should be as priests, right? In their service, they're servants of God, so that they can keep their hands pure, so that they can pray to God on behalf of those who righteously serve as soldiers of Him who reigns righteously. That's a very interesting thing too. Because Origen says there's good soldiers. That's kind of something that we're going to need to consider. It says it's okay to be a soldier. Sort of. As we'll see when he talks about these things, he's always talking about not Christians, non-Christians going to war and doing all these things. Because it says right in the same place that the Christians, their service ought to be prayer for these others that are trying to maintain justice. He says later, and Christians benefit their countries more than do the rest of men, educating the citizens and teaching them to be devout toward the God of the state. Right? In the Christian view, the government has authority from God. Right? And so we ought to submit to it and follow the laws. And that's what Christians do. They teach people to follow the rules and to do what's right. And like I said, he speaks of just wars. He teaches of soldiers fighting righteously, but the context always shows that he's talking about wars waged by non-Christians, right? Because the Christians he holds in a different class, to a different standard. Because they're following a different teaching. Now Christianity is opened up to everybody, right? Anybody ought to be able to become a Christian if they want. But if you're not a Christian, you don't have to follow our rules, right? Now there's going to be consequences later on. But I can't hold you to a standard that you don't believe in. Now, Origen also says he viewed the Christian's duty in regard to war. He put it as clearly as words could make it. Right? He says, once someone has accepted Christianity, you've got to put away your sword. You can't fight anymore. Right? It really can't get more clear than that, right? Christians aren't supposed to fight. They have another job. They have another way to serve. Because one of the big arguments is, well, you have to serve your country. Yeah, I would love to serve your country. But not everyone does their best service with a sword or a gun in their hands. Right? Even in the army, not everybody goes on the front lines to fight. Right? There are many other ways. Now, he has this relative justification, right? Because he says, these non-Christians, they're going to go to war, they can fight righteously. We ought to pray that they'll have justice and all this, right? But that doesn't mean that he's not really serious about his own belief, right? And what he believes for Christians. That doesn't mean that he's inconsistent, because he's very consistent. Christians have a law to follow. We have a rule. And we have to live by that. And that involves not participating in war. Now, later on, Lactantius, and this is a guy who, he lived around the time of Constantine. So he has some writings before Constantine took power and after. And he rules out military service and capital punishment on the ground that because they are homicide, they are a violation of justice. He says this, "And so it will not be lawful for a just man to serve as a soldier, for justice itself is his military service, nor to accuse anyone of a capital offense." Because it makes no difference whether you kill with a word, with a sword, or with a word, since killing itself is forbidden. And so in this commandment of God, no exception at all ought to be made to the rule that it is always wrong to kill a man, from whom God has wished to be regarded as a truly sacred creature. Right? You look back at the history, you know, killing's been wrong since the very beginning. As a society, people decided, well, if we have a government and the one country goes to war against another country, well, that's different. But one thing that is important to think about when we talk about should Christians participate in war, and one reason we might refuse, and this is mentioned in sometimes by some of the writers, talking about the Romans and the barbarian, said that, you know, first of all, think of this. Is it okay for a Christian to kill another Christian? The answer to that's pretty obvious. Right? No. Right? Now, what if the government tells me to kill my fellow Christian? Is that okay? Absolutely not. Right? We know that. It's easy, it's simple. Right? But then you say, well, what if my country is going to war against your country? And we go out to fight each other. Now, I don't know you're a Christian. You're just my enemy, the guy on the other side. My government wants me to kill you. Your government wants you to kill me. Does that make it okay? Still no. Right? We have a rule not to kill. Just because the government wants us to do it, that doesn't mean that it's okay. There's lots of things that the government can't tell Christians what to do. Because we have to follow the laws of God first. Now, does that mean that I don't have any respect for the government? That I'm going to go against them and be a rebel? Of course not, because I'm not going to fight anybody. Right? Because we're peaceful, gentle people that follow the law. But people get angry when you say that you ought to be gentle and you ought not to hurt anybody. It's very strange that people get upset when you say that you shouldn't hurt anybody. But that's the way it is. And looking at all this stuff that we've looked at so far, it's pretty clear that the early Christians believed that. And they lived that. Now, as we'll see, there are some exceptions. There are Christians that went to war. There are Christians that fought and killed. But we're going to have to ask ourselves, Is that the rule? Or is that someone that maybe didn't understand? Now we're going to go in for a little bit and I want to go through just one section here real quick in the disapproval to save us some time for tomorrow. We're going a little over time. I hope you'll permit me. The use of military terms and phrases. Now this is one way in which early Christians kind of accepted war. You look at the Apostle Paul. He's really the first one to start using these military metaphors for Christianity. He talks about the armor of God, the weapons of righteousness in the right hand and the left, the sword of the Spirit. Okay? But it's kind of clear as you start to talk about those things, breastplates of righteousness, shield of faith, that maybe he's not being very literal, right? He talks about fellow Christians as fellow soldiers, fellow captives. He compares human warfare with Christian struggle against evil angelic powers, right? Authorities of darkness. He tells Timothy to be a good soldier of Christ Jesus. And that those who are enrolled in the military, those who enlist, they don't get mixed up in civilian affairs. Okay? Now that kind of sounds like, wow, okay, maybe he's not, he's not talking to Timothy about being a real soldier. Because 2 times, Paul goes out of his way to make it very clear that he's not talking about earthly warfare. Right? He says, though we walk in the flesh, we do not serve as those soldiers according to the flesh. For the weapons of our military service are not of the flesh, but powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds, demolishing theories, and every rampart thrown up against the knowledge of God. We're fighting against theories and ideas and things that go against the knowledge of God. We're not fighting against flesh and blood. He says our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's against the rulers, the authorities, the world potentates of this darkness, against the spiritual forces, of spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And so he says, take up the armor of God. This is not a real flesh and blood battle where I'm going to get a sword and go get somebody. But it is a real battle. Right? You just can't see it. But that imagery, this idea of talking about military things, kind of gets carried on. And that military language starts getting used more and more. And as persecution breaks out, Christians start turning even more and more to this military metaphor because, we've got to unite. We're an army. We've got our camp of light, their camp of darkness. Right? We have our weapons of righteousness. We're fighting against them. All these different things. Christ is like our emperor. Right? And so we set all our symbols up against the symbols of the Roman Empire. And in the Latin church, when the Latin writers, it was even more common than in the East. And it's interesting because the word pagan, right? Paganus, it originally meant civilian, not in the army, right? But as you know now, it means not Christian. So that says something about the power of these military metaphors, right? This idea that someone who's not a soldier is equivalent to someone who's not a Christian. Now, while some people would misunderstand these metaphors, it became very clear that these things were only talking about spiritual warfare. And they don't let Christians just pick up arms and go and fight. I think that's pretty much when we just stop for tonight. So we'll come back tomorrow and we'll finish going through this ways of Christians accepted war. We're going to look at a few other things. Apocalyptic wars and wars in the Old Testament, and even Christian participation in war. So, and then we're going to make some conclusions. And we're going to have some time for questions. So come back tomorrow, 6 o'clock.